When it comes to building lean muscle mass, it's generally accepted that both a combination of diet and exercise are required for muscular growth. In today's video, we're going to talk about the 5 key principles of exercise, along with protein frequency, volume, and timing related to muscle synthesis. The essentials of strength and conditioning teach us there are 5 main principles of exercise: overload, progression, specificity, variation, and reversibility. And if you want to maximize the benefits of your workouts, it's imperative that you stick to all 5 principles in creating an exercise program. We'll combine the first 2 principles, a term coined progressive overload, which an article by Penque et al. States must be adhered to for individuals to continually increase muscle size with resistive training. So what is progressive overload? It's gradually placing greater than normal demands on the exercising musculature. Now, in terms of weightlifting, this could be increasing the weight you lift each week, the volume, or the number of reps and sets, or the frequency, or how many times a week that you train. Principle 3, the principle of specificity, states that exercising a certain body part, component of the body, or the modality by which you exercise will develop that body part or skill. Simply put, to become better at a certain exercise, you should practice that exercise. For example, if building a bigger squat is the goal of your exercise program, certainly you would need to include squats in your exercise selection. And although this may seem like a fairly straightforward principle, it does get a little more complex when you take into account the specific training goals of your program, whether or not you're training for strength, power, hypertrophy, or endurance. Principle 4, the principle of variation, states that performance improvements will decrease if the same exercise or the same loads are used for long periods of time. A general recommendation to adhere to the principle of variation would be to switch up your lifting routine about every 4 weeks or 1 mesocycle. Aside from the physiological benefits of switching up your lifting routine, it also brings psychological benefits. Think about it, if you're doing the same thing in the gym over and over, you're not going to be very motivated. And there's a lot of research that suggests the more motivated you are in the gym, the better your performance is going to be. And the better your performance is, the more muscular gains you're going to have. And variation doesn't necessarily mean that you need to switch up your entire exercise every 4 weeks, but you could switch up the frequency, so the amount of times that you're working out, maybe a 4 to 6 day routine. You could switch up the exercise volume, again, changing your rep and set scheme, or you could change up the modality by which you do an exercise. For example, if you're doing 4 weeks of barbell straight leg deadlifts, you could switch it up to doing 4 weeks of dumbbell straight leg deadlifts, and so on. And finally, principle 5, the principle of reversibility, which states that you can lose the effects of training once you stop, also known as the use it or lose it principle. The principle of reversibility also tells us that strength gains can be maintained for up to 4 weeks of an activity, although an athlete or a trained individual may experience this sooner. A general recommendation would be about 14 days would have no effect on strength or muscular hypertrophy. Now, although about 2 weeks would have no effect on muscular gains, this also depends on how often you're taking 2 weeks off. If you're doing this every month, you're spending just about as much time in the gym as you're spending outside of the gym. So taking long breaks often could be detrimental to strength gains. Before we wrap up the exercise portion of this video, I wanted to mention training frequency, which for a long time has been overlooked for inducing muscular hypertrophy. And just to recap, frequency is the amount of times per week you're training a certain muscle group. The 2017 article by Penque et al. Favors training frequency, as increasing the absolute training load, or the amount of weight you're lifting, will become more difficult as strength gains are attenuated with continued training. Simply put, it's impossible to continually increase the weight you lift each week. There will come a point where you plateau. And although it may seem like a good choice to increase the number of sets performed in a given session, as this would adhere to the principle of progressive overload, there appears to be a point where there's no added benefit by performing additional sets of an exercise. The authors use the example analogous to protein consumption, where 10 grams of protein may be better than 5 for muscle growth, but consuming 80 is not necessarily better than consuming 40. And for this reason, increasing the number of sets performed in a given session may just simply prolong fatigue without providing a greater increase in muscle size. And now, let's talk about protein. There's a few factors that come into play when talking about protein consumption. The ones we'll be covering today are source, frequency, and timing. Although all of our macronutrients, carbs, proteins, and fats, are important for muscle growth, I'm choosing to focus just on protein today, not only for the length of this video, but also because protein is the main structural and functional component of every cell in the human body, which includes muscle cells. Dietary proteins that we consume daily are used for growth and development, as well as building and repairing cells. Is all protein quality the same? Certainly not. A quality protein is one that is easily digestible in the gut and contains all 9 essential amino acids, or amino acids that are not found in the body. Some examples of this would be whey, eggs, poultry, meat, and fish. Soy is the only plant-based protein that contains 8 essential amino acids. However, soy is actually not as digestible in the gut as the quality proteins listed before. And although it may be harder for a vegetarian to get all of the essential amino acids through their diet, it is not impossible, as long as your diet's well-rounded. So now let's talk about protein frequency, or how much and how often should we be ingesting protein. The recommended dietary allowance, or the RDA, would tell us to consume about 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. Now, for an 195-pound male, such as myself, that would only be about 71 grams of protein a day. And if this seems a little low, that's because it is. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the RDA, as it's an older method to calculate protein, and it doesn't really take into consideration athletes or those that are weight training. For an exercising individual, the Essentials of Strength and Conditioning recommends 1 to 1.7 grams per kilogram of body weight a day. And contrary to what most people think, excessive protein consumption isn't really related to kidney or liver damage. In fact, studies show that consumption of up to 2.8 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, which for an 195-pound male would be about 248 grams of protein, has no effect on kidney or liver function. So now that we know roughly how much protein we should be ingesting a day, how often should we be ingesting this protein? A general recommendation of 20 to 30 grams of protein every 3 to 4 hours is enough to stimulate muscle protein synthesis and keep that response elevated throughout the day. The reason being that food, specifically protein, has an anabolic or building up effect on muscle, and the goal is to keep yourself in a net positive protein balance throughout the day. By consuming this 20 to 30 grams in 3 to 4 hour increments, you're able to keep that muscle protein synthetic response elevated, and you're keeping your muscles in an anabolic state throughout the day. And finally, protein timing, or when should you be having your protein in relation to a bout of resistance training. Exercise scientists and nutritionists used to believe there was something called an anabolic window of opportunity. You had to ingest your protein within 45 to 60 minutes after resistance training, or you wouldn't gain any muscle. Now we know that claim's a little ridiculous, and in fact, this anabolic window is a lot larger than we used to think.
In fact, evidence suggests that muscle is sensitized to protein consumption in the post-workout period, and this sensitization can last for 24 hours or more following exercise. So this window of opportunity likely extends at least 4 to 6 hours from the time a person consumes a meal before training. Therefore, at least in young adults, skeletal muscle is still responsive to protein ingestion for at least 24 hours after exercise. And the importance of the immediate post-exercise amino acid or protein ingestion is not as critical as we once often thought. I hope you guys learned something today, and you can apply this information to your own lifting routine. Thanks for watching, everyone.